The wind swept down from the peaks of Haunted Hill, carrying with it a bone-chilling cold that pierced through the forest. The sound it made was almost human, a whisper-like groan as if the mountain itself mourned something lost long ago. For figures, silhouettes against the fading light, made their way along the narrow trail, their laughter slowly fading into uneasy silence as the thick mist closed in around them. None of them knew that they were stepping into a place where time had no meaning and where something old, ancient, and unspeakable watched their every move. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, their fate was sealed. Emily had always been the rational one among her group of friends, but lately, she had begun to feel the weight of her life pressing down on her. At 27, she had already climbed high in her career as a graphic designer, working with some of the biggest brands in the country. But with success came stress, constant deadlines, demanding clients, and the creeping feeling that her work was taking over her life. She barely had time for herself anymore, let alone for her friends. This trip was her idea, a way to reconnect not just with her friends but with herself. She craved the quiet solitude of the mountains, a break from the never-ending noise of the city. The peaceful scenery was exactly what she thought would help her escape the pressures of everyday life, if only for a while. Emily had read about the small, isolated village at the base of Haunted Hill in an old travel magazine. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, far from any modern distractions. The pictures of the valley, the towering pines, and the snow-capped peaks had called to her. It was the perfect escape, or so she thought. At 29, Jack was the adventurous soul of the group. He lived for the thrill of the outdoors, always planning his next hiking expedition or extreme sport adventure. His Instagram was filled with breathtaking shots of him standing on mountain peaks, diving into deep canyons, or racing through rough terrain on his bike. His life looked perfect from the outside, but Jack had begun to feel an emptiness creeping in. He had climbed every mountain, explored every trail. There was nothing left to challenge him. Haunted Hill, with its remote location and eerie legends, was a different kind of adventure. The unknown, the unexplored, excited him in a way that nothing else had in years. He had convinced Mia, his girlfriend, to come along despite her hesitation. Jack knew she wasn't as enthusiastic about the wilderness, but he loved her for her willingness to face her fears for his sake. He planned to propose to her on the top of the mountain, a secret that he hadn't shared with anyone. This trip was supposed to be their perfect gateway. Mia was 26, quiet, and thoughtful. She loved Jack deeply but had always felt a deep-seated fear of the wilderness. There was something about being so far from civilization that unsettled her. While she trusted Jack's skills, the thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains made her anxious. But Jack loved these kinds of trips, and she loved Jack. So she pushed her fear aside, telling herself that this trip would be like all the others, just a hike, some camping, and then they'd be back home, safe and sound. But there was something different about Haunted Hill, something about the way people spoke of it. When Jack first mentioned the place, she felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they shouldn't go. However, she didn't want to ruin the trip with her fears, so she kept them to herself. David was the odd one out in the group. Quiet, introverted, and deeply curious, he had always been fascinated by the supernatural. While his friends considered ghost stories nothing more than entertainment, David took them seriously. He had spent years researching paranormal events, reading everything he could find about the afterlife, spirits, and haunted places. His interest wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. When Emily suggested Haunted Hill as their destination, David had immediately recognized the name. There were old, forgotten legends about the place, stories that didn't make it into the travel guides. It was said that the mountain was cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace. Locals spoke of strange lights, eerie sounds, and a presence that seemed to linger in the air, watching anyone who ventured too far into its depths. David didn't tell the others about these stories. He didn't want to scare them, but he was eager to experience the place for himself. It was a clear, sunny day when the group set out on their journey. The village at the base of Haunted Hill was as picturesque as the photos Emily had seen, with small wooden houses nestled between towering trees. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine. The locals were friendly enough, but strangely distant when the friends mentioned where they were headed. "You're going up to the mountain?" an old woman asked, her wrinkled face tightening in concern. "Not many people go there anymore. It's not a place for tourists." Jack laughed it off, but the others exchanged uneasy glances. The old woman's words stayed with them as they made their way up the trail. The hike was beautiful at first. The sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light on the forest floor. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sound of a nearby stream added a calming background noise. But as they climbed higher, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The sunlight struggled to break through, casting long shadows on the path. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, picked up speed, howling through the trees like a distant wail. "Does anyone else feel weird?" Mia asked, her voice shaky. Emily nodded. "Yeah, it's like, I don't know. It feels heavier up here." David, who had been walking in silence, finally spoke. "We're getting closer to the peak. Places like this have a way of changing as you get higher. It's like the mountain has a personality of its own." Jack rolled his eyes. "Come on, guys, it's just a mountain. You're letting that old woman's stories get to you." But even Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The deeper they ventured into the mountain, the more uneasy he felt. By the time they reached their campsite, the sun was beginning to set. They set up their tents in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves with an eerie sound. Jack started a fire, and soon they were sitting around it, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over the group. David couldn't help but glance at the trees, feeling as though they were being watched. Every now and then, he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, but whenever he looked directly, there was nothing there. "Do you guys know the stories about this place?" he asked, breaking the silence. Mia shivered. "I don't think I want to hear them." Emily, however, was curious. "What stories?" David hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There are legends. The locals believe this mountain is cursed. People who come here disappear. It's been happening for centuries. They say there's something on the mountain, something that watches and waits." Jack scoffed. "Come on, man, don't tell me you actually believe that stuff." David shrugged. "I'm just telling you what I've read. Believe it or not, places like this have a history. Sometimes, things happen that we can't explain." The fire crackled softly in the center of their campsite as the four friends huddled around it, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them since their ascent began. The sun had long set, and now only the pale light of the moon filtered through the thick canopy of trees above. Every so often, the wind would blow through the forest, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the air that seemed to penetrate more than just their skin. It crawled down into their bones. "I don't know, guys," Mia said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "This place feels wrong. I mean, it's beautiful, but..." She glanced nervously over her shoulder at the dark woods surrounding them. "There's something about it." Jack, always eager to reassure her, reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Come on, babe, it's just nerves. You're not used to being out here, but trust me, this is just nature. It's nothing to worry about." But even as he spoke, Jack found himself scanning the trees, his own confidence faltering. The darkness seemed unnaturally thick, like it was swallowing the light of their campfire. And every once in a while, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow at the edge of his vision. Emily stared into the flames, her fingers playing with a loose thread on her jacket. She had been quiet ever since they'd set up camp, the weight of her stress and the old woman's words gnawing at her. This trip was supposed to be an escape, a break from her overwhelming work life, but now it felt like they had wandered into something they couldn't understand. "It's probably just the isolation getting to us," she said, trying to sound reasonable. "We're not used to being this far away from everything." David, who had been silent for most of the evening, spoke up quietly. "That's part of it. But there's something more to this place. I can feel it. Places like this, they have history. You can't just ignore that." Jack rolled his eyes, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that had settled over him since David mentioned the local legends. "Dude, you're always reading too much into this stuff. It's just a mountain. A creepy one, sure, but that doesn't mean there's some evil spirit waiting to get us." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared into the flickering flames, his mind racing through the stories he had read, the warnings he hadn't shared with the others. "Maybe," he muttered under his breath, "but I've learned that sometimes the stories have more truth than we think." As the night wore on, the group grew quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire's warmth was comforting, but it did little to dispel the growing tension. Emily kept glancing nervously toward the dark woods, where the branches seemed to twist and bend in unnatural shapes. Mia clutched Jack's hand tightly, her knuckles white with fear, and David sat perfectly still, listening to the eerie silence of the forest. It was in that silence that they heard it. A low, mournful whistle. At first, it was so faint that they weren't sure if it was real. But then it grew louder, a haunting melody carried by the wind, as if someone or something was calling out to them from deep within the forest. Mia's eyes widened in terror. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Emily stood up, scanning the dark trees for any sign of movement. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though even she didn't believe her own words. But David shook his head slowly. "That's not the wind." The whistling grew louder, more insistent, like it was beckoning them deeper into the forest. The sound was haunting, unsettling, and it sent a wave of cold fear through the group. Even Jack, who prided himself on his bravery, felt his stomach twist in knots. He tried to make light of the situation, cracking a nervous joke. "Well, if it's a ghost, at least it's musical." No one laughed. Suddenly, Mia gasped, her eyes locked on the edge of the clearing. "Look." All eyes turned to where she was pointing. Just beyond the flickering light of the campfire, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and shrouded in shadow. Its outline was vague, almost like it was made of the darkness itself, and its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if time had frozen. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. Jack jumped to his feet, grabbing the flashlight from his backpack. "Stay here," he barked, though his voice betrayed his own fear. He switched on the flashlight and aimed it toward the spot where the figure had been standing, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. "Did you see that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "I saw it," Emily said, her heart pounding in her chest. "It was right there." David stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the trees. "It's watching us," he murmured. "I don't think it's gone." Jack turned to him, his flashlight beam dancing wildly through the trees. "What the hell do you mean it's watching us? There's nothing out there." But deep down, even Jack didn't believe his own words. The group stood in stunned silence for several minutes, their eyes darting around the dark forest, searching for any sign of the figure. But the woods had fallen eerily silent. Even the whistling had stopped. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "We can't stay here." Emily nodded in agreement. "We'll pack up and head back to the village. We'll be safer there." But David shook his head. "It's too late for that." Everyone turned to look at him, their faces pale with fear. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, his voice filled with frustration. David's eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "This place, it doesn't let you leave once you've been marked." The wind howled as the group frantically packed up their belongings, their movements jerky and panicked. The comforting warmth of the fire had faded, leaving behind only cold, suffocating dread. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if the forest itself was closing in around them. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the leaves, felt like a warning. "We can make it back to the village by morning," Jack said, his voice determined but strained. He was trying to keep everyone calm, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. David, however, was no longer concerned with the hike back. His thoughts were consumed by the figure they had seen, by the stories he had read about Haunted Hill. He knew deep down that something far older and far more dangerous was at play here. "The locals talk about this place," he said quietly as they hiked down the trail, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. "They say the mountain is cursed, that spirits of the lost wander the woods." "Spirits?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. David nodded. "It's said that those who disappear here become part of the mountain. They're trapped, forced to haunt the forest forever." Jack scoffed, though the fear was evident in his voice. "You're saying that thing we saw was a ghost?" David didn't respond immediately. He knew it was more complicated than that. "Not just a ghost," he whispered. "Something worse." By the time they stopped to rest, the group was exhausted. They had been walking for hours, but the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly. No matter how far they went, it felt as if they were no closer to the village than when they had started. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds now, and the darkness was impenetrable. Their flashlights barely illuminated the path in front of them, and every shadow seemed to hide something waiting, watching. "We should have reached the village by now," Jack muttered, glancing at his watch. "This doesn't make any sense." Mia sat down on a rock, her legs shaking. "I can't walk anymore. I'm too tired." Emily knelt beside her, her face pale with worry. "We need to keep moving." David, however, wasn't paying attention to their conversation. His eyes were fixed on the trees. He could feel it again, the presence that had been following them, watching them since they first arrived. It was closer now, more persistent. "We're not getting out of here," he said softly. David's soft words hung in the cold air like a death sentence. His calm demeanor only added to the dread that settled over the group. The wind had stilled, leaving only the suffocating silence of the forest. Every instinct told them that something was wrong, terribly wrong. "We're not getting out of here?" Emily repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" David turned to face them, his eyes filled with a grim certainty. "The mountain doesn't let people leave once they've been marked. We saw it. It knows we're here. It's already started." Mia shook her head violently. No, I'm not staying here. We can get out. We just have to keep going, right, Jack?" "Right." Her voice was tinged with panic as she looked to Jack for reassurance. Jack, who had been the one keeping them moving forward, finally faltered. His hands clenched into fists as he stared into the endless darkness around them. He wanted to comfort Mia, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. Something was deeply wrong with this place, and he could feel it too. The forest seemed to twist and bend unnaturally, like the trees themselves were moving when no one was looking. "We keep moving," Jack said firmly, though his voice was tight with fear. "We have to. We're not staying here." David didn't argue, but his expression remained dark, as if he knew the truth and wasn't willing to say it out loud. The mountain had claimed them, and no amount of running would change that. The hours dragged on as they continued their journey down the mountain. The trail twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, as though the path itself was shifting beneath their feet. Every once in a while, they would hear distant sounds, footsteps, rustling leaves, faint whispers carried by the wind, but whenever they turned to look, there was nothing. "Are we going in circles?" Emily asked, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. "I don't know," Jack muttered. His usual confidence was gone now, replaced by a cold fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. "It feels like we've been walking forever," Mia added, her voice trembling. "But we're not getting anywhere." David remained silent, his eyes scanning the trees. He knew they weren't alone. He could feel the presence following them, growing stronger with every step they took. Whatever was watching them, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. "Maybe we should stop," Emily suggested, though the idea of staying in one place terrified her. "We're all exhausted. Maybe we can regroup and figure out where we are." Jack shook his head. "No, we keep going. We can't stop now. If we stop, we'll..." But before he could finish, a loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps. They all froze. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Jack swung his flashlight toward the sound, the beam shaking slightly in his trembling hand. But there was nothing. Just the trees, silent and still, as if mocking them. "It's getting closer," David said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. He was no longer afraid. He had accepted that whatever was following them was inevitable. Suddenly, without warning, something darted between the trees, a dark humanoid figure moving impossibly fast. It was there one moment, gone the next, disappearing into the thick shadows. "Did you see that?" Emily gasped, backing away from the trees. "I saw it," Jack said, his voice strained. "What the hell was that?" Before anyone could answer, the footsteps grew louder, closer. The group huddled together, their flashlights flickering as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow them whole. "Run," Jack whispered urgently. "Run now." Without hesitation, they bolted down the trail, their footsteps pounding against the uneven ground. The forest seemed to close in around them, branches snagging their clothes, the wind howling in their ears. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps behind them never ceased. The presence was right on their heels, gaining ground with every step. After what felt like hours of running, they stumbled into another small clearing, gasping for breath. The darkness was so thick now that it felt like a living entity, suffocating them with its weight. Jack doubled over, hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. We have to keep going," he wheezed. David, his face pale and his eyes distant, looked around at the trees that encircled them. "We're not leaving this place," he said quietly. "It won't let us." Mia collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. I can't do this anymore." Emily knelt beside her, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mia, stay with me. We'll figure this out. We just have to." But then something strange happened. The air around them seemed to shift, as if the forest itself was rearranging. The trees, once familiar, now appeared twisted and contorted, their shapes warping in ways that defied reason. The trail they had been following had vanished completely, leaving only an expanse of impenetrable woods in every direction. "Where's the path?" Jack asked, panic creeping into his voice. "It's gone," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "It was right here, but now it's gone." David stared at the ground, his face pale. "Time doesn't work the same here," he said. "The mountain bends it, distorts it. We're not in the same place anymore." Jack grabbed David's arm, shaking him. "What are you talking about? Time doesn't bend. This is real. We're not in some supernatural nightmare." David's expression was empty, haunted. "We are now." As they stood in the clearing, trying to make sense of what was happening, the air around them grew heavy, almost suffocating. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind died completely. An unnatural stillness descended upon the forest, and the hair on the back of their necks stood on end. Then, from the edge of the clearing, the shadow appeared once again. It stood motionless, its form indistinct but undeniably human-like, though impossibly tall. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, casting a sickly light on the ground below. For a long moment, no one moved. The group stood frozen in terror, unable to tear their eyes away from the figure. What do you want?" Jack finally managed to choke out, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its form seeming to shift and ripple as it moved, as though it was made of the darkness itself. Mia let out a small sob, clutching Emily's arm. Please, we need to go." But there was no escape. The figure continued its slow approach, each step bringing it closer and closer to the group. The air around them grew colder with every movement it made, and a deep, resonating hum filled the clearing, vibrating through the ground. Suddenly, David stepped forward, his eyes locked on the entity. "It's not going to stop," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It wants us." "No," Emily cried, grabbing his arm to pull him back. "Don't go near it." But David shook her off gently, his expression resigned. "This is what it does. It takes people. It's been happening for centuries. We're just the next in line." Before anyone could stop him, David took another step toward the figure. His breath came in slow, shallow gasps as he faced the entity, his body trembling but his mind strangely calm. The figure halted, as if studying him, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The figure stood motionless, and the deep hum in the air grew louder, reverberating through David's bones. And then, without warning, the figure lunged. David vanished in an instant. There was no scream, no sound, just an empty space where he had stood moments before. The others screamed in terror, backing away from the spot where David had been taken. The figure remained still, watching them with its glowing eyes, but it made no further move toward them. It was as if it had gotten what it wanted. "We have to go," Jack shouted, grabbing Mia and Emily and pulling them toward the opposite side of the clearing. "Now." The two women stumbled after him, tears streaming down their faces as they ran blindly through the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, the figure watched, its eyes glowing in the darkness. They didn't stop running until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. But even then, the fear remained. David was gone, taken by something none of them could explain. As they reached the edge of the forest, the village finally coming into view, Emily glanced back over her shoulder. The mountain loomed behind them, silent and still, but she knew they would never truly be free of it. The village came into sight as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the ground. But even in the light of day, a cold fear clung to Jack, Mia, and Emily. They had made it out of the forest, but something had changed, something that couldn't be undone. The villagers watched them with knowing eyes, but no one asked any questions. No one wanted to know what had happened on Haunted Hill. The 3 survivors were met with a silence heavier than the darkness they had escaped, as if the villagers understood the cost of venturing into the cursed mountain. Jack led them to a small inn on the outskirts of the village. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He hadn't spoken a word since they had crossed the tree line. He simply moved on autopilot, as if afraid that if he stopped, the shadow of the mountain would catch up to him. Mia collapsed into a chair, her body trembling uncontrollably. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "David, he's really gone." Emily, sitting beside her, didn't respond. She stared blankly out the window, her mind racing. The questions swirled endlessly. What was that thing? Why had it taken David? And why had it let the rest of them go? Or had it? Jack suddenly stood up, his face pale as if a thought had just occurred to him. "Why did it let us leave?" he asked, his voice strained. "It took David, but why didn't it take all of us?" Mia and Emily exchanged fearful glances, the same question lingering in their minds. Why were they spared? Or had they been spared at all? As the morning light filtered through the window, Emily caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass, something standing just outside the inn, watching them. She blinked and turned to look, but there was nothing there. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears, but she shook it off as nerves, exhaustion, anything but the truth. Nightfall came, and they tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the inn, every whisper of the wind, felt like the mountain calling them back. Jack tossed and turned, while Mia stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, clutching her blankets as if they could protect her from the terror they had left behind. Just as the clock struck midnight, Emily awoke with a start. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a shadow, a tall, distorted figure. The same one they had seen in the forest. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, watching, waiting. Emily screamed, waking Jack and Mia, who bolted upright, their eyes darting around the room. But the figure was gone, leaving behind only the suffocating silence of the night. Breathless, Emily whispered, "It followed us." Jack's face drained of color as the reality sunk in. "We never left," he muttered. "We never really left the mountain." A cold wind howled outside the inn, rattling the windows. In the distance, the faint sound of whistling echoed through the air, low and mournful, the same melody they had heard that first night on Haunted Hill. And as the sound grew louder, a chilling realization settled over them. The mountain wasn't just cursed. It was alive. It had chosen them. Their time was running out. The next morning, the innkeeper found the room empty. Jack, Mia, and Emily were gone, leaving no trace behind. The villagers didn't ask where they had gone or what had happened. They already knew. Just like David, the 3 had become part of the mountain, lost forever in the shadows of Haunted Hill. The legend would continue, and the mountain would wait for its next visitors, eager to claim more souls, one by one. But what truly happened to them? Were they trapped in the endless woods, reliving their fear over and over? Or were they now the shadows that watched, waiting for others to fall into the same trap? No one would ever know for sure. Only the mountain knew, and it would never tell.